Oregon is famous for its breathtaking wilderness, but for a tragic few, those deep forests become a permanent trap. Today, we're exploring the 10 most disturbing disappearances in Oregon's history. These baffling cases defy logic, break hearts, and fuel nightmares. If you love deep dives into the unexplained, please hit subscribe and like the video. It really helps us out. Now, lock your doors, stay on the trail, and let's get into it. There's a ghost town in southern Oregon called Copper. And I don't mean ghost town in the cute historical sense, like there's a saloon with a plaque on it and a gift shop selling turquoise. I mean the place is gone. It was a mining settlement that the mountains slowly swallowed back up, leaving behind a general store, a handful of dirt roads, and mile after mile of the Siskiyou wilderness pressing in from every direction. It's the kind of place where the silence has weight to it, where the trees are so tall and so old that the canopy blocks out the sky, and you can stand perfectly still at noon and hear absolutely nothing but the creek. That's where an entire family disappeared over Labor Day weekend in 1974. A father, a mother, a 5-year-old boy, a 5-month-old baby. All 4 of them are gone, ripped out of existence between breakfast and dinner on a quiet Sunday in September. And when someone finally drove up to their campsite, what they found wasn't chaos. It wasn't a crime scene. It was something worse. Everything was exactly where they'd left it, as if they'd just stopped being there. Let me take you back. It's late August, 1974. Richard Cowden is 28 years old, a logging truck driver out of White City, Oregon, which is a small working-class town in the Rogue Valley. He's the kind of guy who works with his hands 6 days a week and looks forward to getting out into the mountains when he can. His wife, Belinda, is 22. They've got David, Belinda's 5-year-old son from her first marriage, and Melissa, the couple's infant daughter, just 5 months old. They also have a basset hound named Droopy. The Cowdens are not complicated people. They are a young family doing what young families in rural Oregon did in the 70s, scraping by, raising kids, and finding joy in the cheap, beautiful things the Pacific Northwest hands you for free. They made the decision to go last minute, loaded up the 1956 Ford pickup, packed the camping gear, grabbed the dog, and drove deep into the Siskiyou Mountains to a spot called Carberry Creek, a primitive campground near the remains of Copper, tucked into a landscape of steep hillsides, ancient timber, and cold mountain water. No electricity, no phones, no neighbors for miles, just the sound of the creek and the wind in the Douglas firs. They arrived on Friday, August 30th, and set up camp. By all accounts, it was exactly the kind of weekend they were hoping for. Peaceful, yet uneventful, normal. Sunday morning, September 1st. Around 9 o'clock, Richard takes David by the hand and walks down from the campsite to the Copper General Store, the last remnant of the old mining town, run by a woman named Ruth Grayson Smith, who also happened to be Belinda's mother. Richard buys a single quart of milk. He chats with Ruth for a few minutes. He's relaxed. He's in no hurry. He confirms their plans for that evening. Ruth is going to drive up to the campsite and join the family for a Sunday dinner. A nice end to a nice weekend. Richard and David walk back up the dirt road toward camp. Ruth watches them go. That is the last time anyone sees any member of the Cowden family alive. That evening, Ruth drives up to Carberry Creek for the dinner she'd been promised. She pulls up to the campsite. The truck is there. The camp is set up, but there are no people, no voices, no fire crackling, no baby crying, just the dogless silence of an empty clearing in the woods and the long shadows of the Siskiyous creeping across the ground. She assumes they went on a hike. Maybe they took the dog and lost track of time. She waits. The sun goes down. The temperature drops. Nobody comes back. By Monday morning, the alarm is raised. Law enforcement arrives at the campsite. And what they find, or rather what they don't find, will haunt this investigation for the next 50 years. Now, this is where it gets strange. And I need you to really picture this, because the state of that campsite is the single most disturbing piece of evidence in this entire case. The truck is parked exactly where you'd expect it. The keys? still in the ignition. Belinda's purse is sitting out in the open, untouched. Richard's wallet is right there, $21 cash inside, which in 1974, money is closer to $140 today. His wristwatch, an expensive one, is lying in plain view. Nobody took it. On the ground near the camp table, there's a plastic dishpan filled with water that has long since gone cold. It's soapy. Someone was in the middle of washing dishes and just stopped. The camp stove is assembled and ready to cook on. The carton of milk, the same quart Richard bought at the general store that morning, is sitting on the picnic table, half full, slowly going bad in the September heat. The baby's diaper bag is sitting out, fully stocked. Think about that last detail. If you are a parent of a 5-month-old infant, you do not leave the campsite without the diaper bag. You don't go on a hike without it. You don't walk to the creek without it. That bag goes where the baby goes. Always. Its presence at the camp means one of two things. Either Belinda left without her baby, or Belinda left so fast she didn't have time to grab it. And then there's the clothing. When investigators went through the truck, they found all of the family's packed clothes. Every shirt, every pair of jeans, every jacket. The only items of clothing unaccounted for were their bathing suits, which means that when the Cowden family left that campsite, voluntarily or not, they were almost certainly wearing nothing but swimwear. No shoes were confirmed missing, no jackets, no pants, just bathing suits. Let that sit for a second. A 28-year-old man, a 22-year-old woman holding a 5-month-old baby, and a 5-year-old little boy walked away from their camp in the Siskiyou Mountains wearing bathing suits, and not a single one of them ever came back. So let's tear this apart. Let's look at the theories and see which ones survive contact with the actual evidence. First theory is they went for a hike and got lost. Okay, in their bathing suits, without the diaper bag, without shoes, into some of the most rugged, steep, and unforgiving terrain in the Pacific Northwest. Even if we accept that scenario, even if we say Richard decided to take the whole family, including an infant, on a spontaneous barefoot march through the mountains, that doesn't explain the dishes. You don't stop mid-wash, put down the soapy pan, and decide to go for a stroll. Something interrupted them, and whatever it was sudden. Another theory is an animal attack, or a bear, a cougar, something that came out of the tree line and overwhelmed them. But here's the thing. Look at the campsite again. There is no blood. There are no claw marks on the table. There are no overturned chairs, no scattered supplies, no torn fabric caught on a branch. If a large predator attacked a family of 4 at a campsite, the aftermath would be absolute carnage. You'd see it. You'd smell it. The campsite was pristine, untouched. Whatever happened to the Cowdens, it didn't happen there. Which brings us to the theory that keeps investigators up at night. Someone came out of those woods, someone human. But even this theory is riddled with impossible questions. How do you subdue a healthy 28-year-old working man, a guy who drives logging trucks for a living, along with his wife and 2 children, without creating a scene? How do you force 4 people, one of them a screaming infant, away from a campsite without leaving a single drop of blood, a single scuff mark, a single sign of resistance? How do you do all of this in broad daylight, in a campground where other people were staying that weekend, without anyone hearing a single scream? The answer, most investigators believe, is a gun. You walk into that clearing with a firearm, and the math changes instantly. A father isn't going to fight when a barrel's pointed at his 5-year-old. A mother isn't going to scream when the threat is aimed at the baby in her arms. You march them into the woods in their bathing suits, quiet and compliant, and the campsite stays exactly the way they left it, frozen in time, a dishpan full of cold, soapy water. For 7 months, the Cowden family was simply missing. Massive search operations combed the mountains. Helicopters flew infrared photography runs over the canopy. Over 150 volunteers walked shoulder-to-shoulder grid searches through the timber. Nothing. Then, in April of 1975, 2 gold prospectors hiking a steep, heavily wooded hillside roughly 7 miles from the campsite stumbled onto something no one was expecting to find. Richard Cowden's body tied to a tree on a steep incline, and nearby, concealed inside a small, very specific cave hidden beneath a rock overhang, the remains of Belinda, David, and baby Melissa. But here's the detail that turns this case from a tragedy into something far more sinister. A local volunteer searcher immediately came forward and told police something chilling. He had personally, physically searched that exact cave during the September 1974 grid search. He was certain of it. He walked police back to the location, confirmed it was the same cave, and swore under oath that it was completely empty when he checked it 7 months earlier. Which means someone moved those bodies. Months after the murder, long after the search teams had packed up and the helicopters had gone home, someone went back into those mountains, hiked 7 miles of rugged terrain, and relocated the remains of a mother and her 2 children into a cave they knew the searchers had already cleared. That's not a crime of passion. That's not a random act. That is calculated, patient, deeply familiar behavior from someone who knew those mountains like the back of their hand. The primary suspect was a man named Dwayne Lee Little, at 25 years old in 1974. He'd been released from the Oregon State Penitentiary just 3 months earlier, paroled after serving time for the rape and murder of a teenage girl. State police confirmed Little was in the Copper area that Labor Day weekend. Witnesses reported a truck matching his acting suspiciously near the campgrounds. Autopsies determined that Belinda and David were killed by .22 caliber gunshots, and Little's girlfriend testified she saw him with a .22 rifle around that time. A cellmate even claimed Little confessed to the whole thing behind bars. Despite all of that, the presence, the weapon match, the jailhouse confession, Dwayne Lee Little was never formally charged with the murders of the Cowden family. The case remains officially unsolved, over 50 years and counting. I keep coming back to that campsite, to the dishpan full of soapy water sitting on the ground, to the half-empty carton of milk slowly curdling on the picnic table, to the diaper bag that should have gone wherever Melissa went but didn't, to the $21 in Richard's wallet that nobody bothered to steal. And I keep thinking about Monday morning, about the basset hound, Droopy, showing up alone at the front door of the Copper General Store, scratching and whimpering, looking for someone familiar, looking for his family. Something stepped out of the Siskiyou wilderness on that quiet Sunday morning and erased an entire family without making a sound, without leaving a trace, without disturbing a single dish. And then it waited 7 months and went back to hide them. But they were found. And nobody's ever been held accountable. And that campsite, that frozen, impossible, a perfectly ordinary campsite, still doesn't make any sense. There's a very specific kind of silence in the Pacific Northwest backcountry in December. It's not the silence of an empty room, it's heavier than that. When the snow is fresh and deep and the canopy is thick with ponderosa pine, sound doesn't carry. It gets absorbed, muffled, swallowed whole by the timber and the drifts. You can shout someone's name and hear it die 10 feet in front of your face. On the afternoon of December 5th, 1998, in the Winema National Forest near Klamath Falls, Oregon, a father turned around to look for his 8-year-old son. The boy had been right behind him, walking in his footprints, playing in the snow the way any kid would on a cold Saturday afternoon in the woods. The father called his name. The forest swallowed it. He called again. Nothing. He walked back to the spot where the boy had been standing moments earlier, and the snow was empty. No child, no sound, no trail leading anywhere that made sense. His name was Derek Engebretson. He was 8 years old, dressed in a blue snowmobile suit with a small hatchet on his belt and Goosebumps gloves on his hands. He was out with his father and grandfather to do one of the most ordinary things a family can do in December in Oregon: find a Christmas tree and cut it down. He vanished in the time it takes to crest a hill, and the forest has never given him back. Let me set this up, because the setting matters enormously. The Winema National Forest sprawls across hundreds of thousands of acres of high-elevation volcanic terrain in south-central Oregon, near the town of Klamath Falls. In the summer, it's gorgeous, big pines, mountain meadows, clear creeks. In December, it's something else entirely. The elevation pushes past 5,000 feet in places. The snow is deep and persistent. The roads are plowed only to a point, and beyond that point, you are on your own in a frozen, silent wilderness that stretches for miles in every direction. On December 5th, 1998, the Engebretson family drove out to a spot near Pelican Butte in the Rocky Point area to find their Christmas tree. This was a tradition. Families did it every year, piled into the truck, drove out to a permitted cutting area, hiked around in the snow until they found the right one, and brought it home. It's one of those wholesome Norman Rockwell activities that people in the Pacific Northwest take for granted. There's nothing dangerous about it. You're near a paved logging road. You've got your family with you. The woods are quiet and beautiful. And the worst thing that usually happens is you pick a tree that turns out to be lopsided once you get it in the living room. Derek was having the time of his life. 8 years old, nicknamed Bear Boy by his family because the kid was an absolute force of nature in the outdoors. He could hike 20 miles. He knew the woods. He was wearing appropriate gear: the blue snowmobile suit, navy pants, camouflage felt-lined boots, a denim jacket, and those goosebumps gloves. He even had a small hatchet because, of course, Bear Boy brought a hatchet to cut down a Christmas tree. This was his element. Early afternoon. The three of them, Derek, his father, and his grandfather, are walking through the snow, staying relatively close to the paved logging road. The terrain is hilly, unscattered with large pines, and covered in a fresh white blanket. It's cold, but manageable. The kind of afternoon where your breath hangs in the air and every step crunches. At some point, the group's formation stretches. Derek's father walks ahead, eventually cresting a snowy hill and moving out of direct line of sight. The grandfather is walking with Derek, a few paces behind. When the grandfather sees the father disappear over the hill, he tells Derek to follow his dad's fresh footprints up the slope. Simple instructions. Just walk in the tracks. Derek starts up the hill, he crests it, and he's gone. His father's on the other side, expecting to see the boy come over the top any second. He doesn't. The grandfather reaches the crest and looks down the other side. No Derek. They call his name. Nothing comes back but the dense, muffled silence of the forest. The panic is immediate. They search the immediate area, under trees, behind snowbanks, down the slope in every direction. Nothing. By 4:13 p.m., they've flagged down a passing motorist on the road. The motorist drives 2 miles to a nearby resort and calls 911. Law enforcement mobilizes, search teams begin arriving, and then the weather makes its move. A massive blizzard descends on Pelican Butte that evening. Visibility drops to nothing. Temperatures plunge well below zero. The wind erases tracks and buries evidence under fresh drifts. The storm doesn't just complicate the search, it destroys it. By December 18th, conditions are so extreme that the official search is suspended because the rescuers themselves are at risk of dying. Now, this is where it gets strange. Because when the weather finally broke and searchers were able to get back into the area, what they found didn't point in one direction. It pointed in about 5 directions at once. First, the snow angel. Somewhere near the roadway, searchers found an undisturbed snow angel, the kind a kid makes by lying down and sweeping their arms and legs. A moment of play. Pure childhood innocence frozen into the surface of the snow. It means Derek was alive and having fun in this area, probably within a very short window of when he disappeared. He wasn't panicked yet. He wasn't running. He was being a kid. Second, the candy wrapper and the bookmark. Volunteer searchers found a discarded candy wrapper and a bookmark from Bonanza School, the school Derek attended. These were his. They placed him in a specific area near Rocky Point. But right next to these items, investigators found something that changed the entire tone of the search. Blood. Physical blood of unknown origin, sitting in the snow adjacent to the belongings of an 8-year-old boy. That blood was never conclusively identified. But its presence next to Derek's personal items transforms this from a lost child in the woods scenario into something potentially far more violent. Third, the shelter. Deeper in the timber, searchers discovered a crude survival shelter built from fir boughs, carefully constructed and tucked beneath fallen logs. Bear Boy had a hatchet. Bear Boy knew the woods. It's entirely plausible that an 8-year-old with his skills could have built that shelter to survive the incoming blizzard. It would be exactly the kind of thing he'd do. Except for one problem: search dogs were brought to the shelter, and they could not detect Derek's scent at the site. Trained tracking dogs, calibrated to follow human scent through wilderness conditions, hit nothing. If Derek built that shelter, his smell should be all over it. It wasn't, which raises the deeply uncomfortable possibility that someone else built it. Let's talk about the physics of this disappearance, because nothing about it works. They were in fresh snow, deep, soft December snow at high elevation. An 8-year-old boy weighing maybe 60 or 70 pounds is going to leave tracks. Clear, deep, unmistakable tracks, every single step pressed into the surface like a stamp. If Derek simply wandered off, got disoriented, took a wrong turn, Pete walked in the wrong direction, there should be a continuous line of footprints leading away from the last place he was seen. You follow the tracks. You find the child. That's how it works. But searchers could not establish a clear, continuous trail. The blizzard destroyed some of it, certainly. But the initial search began before the worst of the storm. In that window, the tracks should have been readable. They weren't. How does an 8-year-old walk through deep snow without leaving a traceable path? He doesn't. Not unless something interrupted that path, not unless he was picked up off the ground. And that brings us to the witnesses. Because there were 2 sightings that day that law enforcement could never fully explain or dismiss. The first, an unidentified adult male driving a 2-door black Honda, was spotted in the area that afternoon, acting erratically, repeatedly asking passers-by for directions deep in the forest. Who drives a 2-door Honda into the backcountry of the Weinmann National Forest in December? That's not a vehicle built for logging roads and snowpack. That car had no business being there. The second, a separate witness reported seeing an adult male physically struggling with a young boy near the tree line that afternoon. Struggling, not playing, not horsing around. An adult physically grappling with a child. The witness assumed it was a father disciplining a misbehaving kid and drove on. Think about that. Someone saw what may have been an abduction in progress and made the completely understandable, a completely human assumption that it was a parent having a tough moment, and they kept driving. That single decision, reasonable, logical, impossible to blame anyone for, may have been the difference between Derek Engebretsen coming home and Derek Engebretsen vanishing forever. In 2004, 6 years after Derek disappeared, a convicted child predator named Frank James Milligan became the primary suspect. A fellow inmate reported that Milligan had bragged about the crime behind bars. When interrogated, Milligan did something unexpected. He confessed, in detail. He offered to lead authorities to the body in exchange for immunity from the death penalty. Case closed, right? Finally, an answer. Not exactly. Authorities took Milligan to the location he specified. They searched. They dug. They found absolutely nothing. No remains, no clothing, or no evidence of any kind. And when confronted with the empty ground, Milligan recanted everything. Took it all back, said he made it up. So either Milligan killed Derek and lied about the burial location, or Milligan is exactly what some investigators suspect, a deeply disturbed individual who inserted himself into a high-profile case for attention. Either way, the confession led nowhere, and the real answer stayed buried under the snow. Derek Engebretsen has been missing for over 27 years. His disappearance is permanently fused to the holiday season, a family tradition that became a life sentence of grief. Every December, when the snow falls on the Weinmann National Forest and families drive out to cut their Christmas trees, the Engebretsen family carries an absence that no amount of time can fill. The blood in the snow, the scentless shelter, the black Honda that had no reason to be there, the witness who saw a man struggling with a boy and kept driving. Every piece of evidence points toward something terrible happening in those woods on December 5th, 1998. But the blizzard that rolled in that night did what blizzards do. It buried everything, every track, every trace, every chance of finding out what happened in the minutes after an 8-year-old boy crested a snowy hill and dropped off the edge of the world. His father turned around. The snow was empty, and the silence that came back when he called his son's name has never broken. Picture this. You're standing at the edge of a campfire at 4:30 in the morning. Behind you, there's music still thumping from a portable speaker. People are scattered around in camp chairs, talking too loud, laughing at nothing, winding down from a long night in the way that only happens deep in the woods when nobody has anywhere to be tomorrow. There are coolers and tents and the smell of smoke and cheap beer and pine sap. It feels safe. It feels familiar. It feels like every camping trip you've ever been on with your friends. Now, turn around and face the other direction. 20 feet past the last tent, the firelight just stops. And what's beyond it is a wall of black. Not city dark. Not power outage dark. Oregon wilderness at 4 in the morning dark, where the timber is so dense and the canopy so thick that you cannot see your own hand in front of your face. The terrain drops off into steep ravines and climbs back up through underbrush so tangled you'd need a machete to move through it in daylight, let alone in the dead of night. On one side of that line, a party. On the other, an abyss. And sometime around 4:30 a.m. on August 5th, 2020, a 27-year-old man named Michael Bryson reportedly crossed that line. Walked away from the campfire, away from the music, away from the people who were supposed to be his friends, and stepped into the dark. Nobody followed him, nobody stopped him, and nobody has seen him since. The place was called Hobo Camp, which is not an official campground name you'll find on any Forest Service map. It's a dispersed camping area deep in the Umpqua National Forest near Dorena, Oregon, the kind of spot that gets passed around by word of mouth. No reservations, no camp hosts, no cell service, no running water. You drive up a series of increasingly narrow logging roads until the pavement ends, then the gravel ends, and then you're just bouncing along a dirt track through old-growth timber until you reach a clearing where people have been partying for years. It's remote in a way that most people don't really understand until they're standing in it. The nearest town might as well be on another planet. The occasion was a birthday party, but calling it a birthday party makes it sound like there were balloons and a cake. This was a multi-day event, an underground rave in the woods, electronic music, heavy drinking, and, according to multiple accounts, a significant amount of drug use among the attendees. People had been trickling in since the beginning of the week. By the time the night of August 4th rolled around, there were dozens of people scattered through the trees. Michael Bryson was one of them, 27 years old, out from the Junction City area. By every account from the people who loved him, Michael was magnetic. Outgoing, warm, the kind of guy who lit up a room or a campsite. He was deeply close to his parents, Parrish and Tina Bryson, the kind of close where he'd stop by the house just to say, hey, before heading out for the weekend, which is exactly what he did before this trip. He swung by, told his parents he was heading up to the mountains for a friend's birthday, and said he'd be back in a few days. That was Monday, August 3rd, the last time his parents saw their son. Here's what we're told happened next. Michael arrives at Hobo Camp and settles in. He sets up his tent. He's socializing, having a good time, doing exactly what you'd expect a 27-year-old to do at a camping party with friends. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. But there's one detail that's easy to miss, and it matters. Michael's cell phone was powered off, not dead, powered off, and it didn't go dark on the night he disappeared. According to investigators, the phone had been off for days before August 5th. In 2020, a 27-year-old voluntarily shutting off his phone for multiple days is already unusual. But the fact that it was off before the night in question means there was no GPS data, no text messages, no call logs, nothing to reconstruct his movements leading up to the disappearance. The digital trail doesn't just go cold, it was never there. Now. The night of August 4th bleeds into the early morning of August 5th. The party is winding down. Most people are either passed out or sitting around in that glazed 4 in the morning haze. And at some point around 4:30 a.m., according to the people who were there, Michael becomes upset. The reason? Nobody can agree. Some people say he was in an argument. Some say he was agitated but won't say about what. Some say they don't remember much of anything from that night at all. What they all agree on is this: Michael walked away from the camp, into the dark, alone, and then nothing. When the sun came up on August 5th, Michael's tent was still standing. His camping gear was inside it, untouched. His phone, his wallet, his keys, all there. Everything a person needs to function in the modern world, left behind like he'd stepped out for 30 seconds and just never came back. Now, this is where it gets strange. And I don't mean the disappearance itself, I mean the behavior of everyone around it. Let's start with the gear. Michael Bryson is not a tourist. He's someone who knows the outdoors, who has camped before, who understands what the Oregon wilderness is capable of. At 4:30 a.m. in the Umpqua National Forest, it is pitch black. The terrain is steep, rocky, riddled with ravines and covered in undergrowth that can trip you up in broad daylight. Why would a person who respects the outdoors walk into that without a flashlight, without a phone, without even grabbing a jacket? It goes against every basic human instinct for self-preservation. You don't walk into the void empty-handed unless you're not thinking clearly, or unless you're not walking voluntarily. Now let's talk about the people at that party, because this is where the case goes from strange to deeply suspicious. According to Michael's parents and to investigators who worked the case, the stories from the partygoers didn't add up. These accounts were fragmented, contradictory, and evasive. Some people couldn't or wouldn't explain why Michael was upset. Some gave timelines that didn't match other people's timelines. And here's the part that Parrish and Tina Bryson have never been able to let go of. Some of the attendees packed up and left the campground almost immediately after Michael went missing. Not the next day, not after a search, almost right away. Hold on, let's think about that. Your friend, a guy you've been partying with all week, walks into the woods in the middle of the night and doesn't come back. The sun comes up. He's not at his tent. His stuff is all there. He's just gone. What is the normal human response? You organize a search, you yell his name, you fan out into the trees, you do everything you possibly can before you call for help. What you don't do is break down your tent, load up your truck, and drive home. Unless you already know he's not coming back. Unless you know something you're not saying. Law enforcement launched extensive search and rescue operations. The Lane County Sheriff's Office deployed K-9 units, drones, and ground teams through the surrounding forest. They found nothing. No footprints leading away from the camp, no torn clothing caught on a branch, no disturbance in the brush consistent with a person crashing through the underbrush in the dark. If Michael had simply wandered off and succumbed to the elements or a fall, there should be physical evidence of his path. A body. Remains. Something. The forest gave back absolutely nothing. Then, 4 months later, in December 2020, detectives received a specific tip. They went back into the woods and recovered multiple items of Michael's clothing in an area that had previously been searched, not deep in some unexplored drainage miles from camp, in an area that ground teams and canine units had already covered. Read that again. Clothing, found months later, in a zone that was supposedly cleared. If those clothes were there in August, the dogs would have hit on them. Trained search and rescue dogs are specifically calibrated to detect human scent in wilderness environments. That's their entire purpose. If Michael's clothing was lying in those woods during the initial search, those dogs would have found it. If the clothes weren't there in August, then someone placed them there after the fact. Someone went back into those woods months later and deposited evidence. Either explanation is devastating. One means the search failed catastrophically. The other means someone was staging a scene. Michael Bryson has never been found. The Lane County Sheriff's Office has stated publicly that they remain open to the possibility of criminal action and have not ruled out foul play. But no arrests have been made, no charges have been filed. The case is still officially open. What isn't open to debate is the relentless, tireless campaign waged by Parrish and Tina Bryson to keep their son's name in the public eye. They have organized community searches. They have built a massive social media following dedicated to generating tips. They have done everything two parents can possibly do to shake the truth loose from a group of people who, by all appearances, have chosen silence over accountability. And that's the thing that makes this case different from a standard wilderness disappearance. When a hiker goes missing on a solo trek and the forest claims them, there's a tragic simplicity to it. Nature won. But Michael Bryson wasn't alone. He was surrounded by people. He was at a party. There were dozens of potential witnesses within earshot, and not a single one of them can provide a coherent, consistent account of what happened in the darkest hours of August 5th, 2020. Somebody at that campfire knows what happened to Michael Bryson. Somebody watched him walk into the dark or watched him get taken there. And for 4 years, that somebody has been living with it, carrying the weight of a secret that a family in Junction City would give anything to hear. The forest doesn't talk, but people do. Eventually. There's a road in Josephine County, Oregon, called Rubin Mountain Road. It's not on most maps. It doesn't go anywhere. It's one of those Bureau of Land Management logging roads that starts as gravel, turns to dirt, narrows to a single lane, and eventually just stops, dead-ending in a wall of Douglas fir and silence. No cell service, no houses, no mile markers. If your car breaks down out there, you're walking, and you'd better know which direction town is, because nothing about that road is going to tell you. On September 23, 2020, a group of hunters driving that road came across something that didn't belong there. A dark blue Jeep Grand Cherokee locked tight, sitting quietly on a spur road off the main track, half hidden by the brush. It had been there for months. The windows were rolled up, the doors were secure. The dust and pine needles had settled across it like a burial shroud. The Jeep belonged to a 45-year-old woman named Fauna Frey. She had been missing since late June, and the last confirmed trace of her existence was a grocery store receipt for 10 cans of tuna, time-stamped 3 months before that Jeep was found. Nobody knows how the Jeep got there, nobody knows if Fauna drove it, and nobody has ever found Fauna. Let me back up, because the context matters. Grants Pass, Oregon, is one of those towns that looks like a postcard from the highway. The Rogue River cutting through the valley, surrounded by green mountains and summer wildflowers. People raft, people fish, people stop at the organic food co-op and the farmer's market and feel like they found a little slice of paradise. But just a few miles off the main road, but in any direction, that paradise gets very dark very fast. Josephine County is a labyrinth of unmarked logging roads, abandoned mining claims, and off-grid properties that don't show up on Google Maps. Cell service drops to zero as soon as you leave the valley floor. Law enforcement is stretched thin across an enormous geographic area, and the county has a well-documented reputation, among locals and investigators alike, as a hotspot for illicit drug operations running deep in the timber. It's the kind of place where the beautiful surface and the dangerous underbelly exist in the same square mile, separated by nothing more than a turn onto an unmarked dirt road. That's the world Fauna Roseanne Frey drove into at the end of June 2020. Fauna was 45 years old, living temporarily with her father, John Frey, in Dexter, Oregon, where she was in pain. Just a week earlier, on June 19th, she had personally discovered her brother Dallas deceased in his home from heart failure. The grief was fresh and raw and overwhelming. Her plan for the week was straightforward: drive down to the Grants Pass area, personally notify several of Dallas's closest friends of his passing, and distribute portions of a small inheritance, silver bullion coins, as a memorial gesture. A road trip fueled by grief, generosity, and a desire to do right by her brother's memory. She left home on the evening of June 27th in her dark blue 2000 Jeep Grand Cherokee. She packed light, no extra clothing, planning to sleep in the vehicle. She was expected back within a day or two. June 28th, Fauna meets with some of her brother's friends in the Wolf Creek area, north of Grants Pass. The visits go well. She's grieving but functional. At some point during the day, she does something uncharacteristic. She picks up a hitchhiker near the Wilderville Cemetery and gives the woman a ride toward Fish Hatchery Road. This is notable because Fauna's father later described her as someone who would never do this under normal circumstances. That evening, she checks into a Super 8 motel in Grants Pass. She calls her father, and the tone of that call is the first crack in the timeline. Fauna sounds disoriented, distressed, paranoid about the motel. She speaks about seeing angels. Her father, John, later described it as a rapid and alarming deterioration from the woman he'd spoken to the day before. June 29th, morning. Fauna checks out of the Super 8 at 8:35 a.m. At 9:44, she withdraws $200 from an Umpqua Bank ATM. At 12:39 p.m., she walks into a Big 5 sporting goods store and buys a lantern, flashlights, new shoes, and activewear. At 1:39 p.m., she's captured on camera at Gooseberry's, an organic grocery store in Grants Pass, purchasing 10 cans of tuna and other supplies. At 2:39 p.m., she calls the Wisku Inn to make a room reservation with a 3 p.m. check-in. She never arrives. Her bank accounts go completely dormant. Her phone goes silent. Her Jeep doesn't appear on any camera, at any gas station, on any road. Between 2:39 p.m. on June 29th and the discovery of her vehicle 3 months later, Fauna Frey disappears from the modern world as completely as if she'd never existed. Now, this is where it gets strange, because the trail of evidence Fauna left behind in the final hours before she vanished tells two completely contradictory stories. Let's start with the purchases. At 12:39 p.m., less than 2 hours before she disappears, Fauna is buying a lantern, flashlights, and new shoes. Those are not the purchases of someone who has given up. Those are not the purchases of someone planning to harm themselves. Those are the purchases of someone who expects to need light tonight and comfortable shoes tomorrow. She's buying survival gear. She's buying supplies. She called to make a hotel reservation an hour later. She was planning a future. And the groceries. 10 cans of tuna. That's not a last meal. That's a week's worth of protein. She was stocking up. She was preparing for something that required provisions. Whatever Fauna was thinking at 1:39 p.m. on June 29th, it was not about ending. It was about continuing. But here's the thing. There's another layer to this story, and it's the one that keeps investigators up at night. Fauna Frey was not just carrying grief and canned tuna through Grants Pass that week. She was carrying approximately $18,000 worth of .999 silver bullion rounds and buffalo head nickels. 40 pounds of it. Physical, tangible, highly valuable, and nearly impossible to trace. She'd started with roughly $25,000 in silver, her brother's inheritance, and had already gifted a portion to a friend. The rest was with her, in her vehicle. In a region where the drug economy operates on cash and barter and where untraceable precious metals are as good as currency. She was a grieving, disoriented woman driving alone through one of the most dangerous rural corridors in Oregon with 40 pounds of silver in the back of her Jeep. If you were designing a scenario for predatory opportunity, you could not build a more perfect one. Let's talk about the Jeep, because the Jeep is the Rosetta Stone of this case, and it raises more questions than it answers. When hunters found it on Rubin Mountain Road in September, it was locked. The newly purchased shoes were inside, but they were the wrong size. A sentimental Lion King VHS tape was there, and there was an unused box of dark hair dye. Hold on. Hair dye. Why does a woman on a 2-day grief trip to visit her brother's friends have a box of hair dye in her car? You buy hair dye when you want to change how you look. That's a deliberate, conscious decision to alter your appearance. Was Fauna planning to disguise herself? Was she scared of someone? Or did someone else put that box in her vehicle? And the shoes being the wrong size. Fauna bought those shoes herself, on camera, at Big 5. How do you buy shoes in the wrong size? Did she grab the wrong box in a hurry? Was she buying them for someone else? The detail is small, but it doesn't fit. And in a case like this, nothing that doesn't fit should be ignored. More importantly, Fauna's father, John, stated flatly that she would never navigate Rubin Mountain Road alone. She didn't know the area. She was from out of town. That road is not something you stumble onto. You have to know it's there. You have to deliberately turn off the paved road and drive miles into the backcountry on a deteriorating dirt track. Either Fauna was led there by someone who knew the way, or someone else drove her Jeep there after she was already gone. And then there's the saddlebag. Years after Fauna vanished, the property on Fish Hatchery Road, the same road where Fauna dropped off the hitchhiker, the same property that local residents identified as a known drug house, was sold. The new owners were cleaning up the place when they found a leather saddlebag tied to a carport post near the ground. Fauna's name was physically stamped into the leather. The bag had been mutilated, cut in half, repurposed into a crude purse. Inside were cigarette butts and loose American Spirits tobacco, despite Fauna rarely smoking. Her father interpreted the discovery as a deliberate message, a trophy, the kind of thing someone keeps not because it's useful, but because it reminds them of what they did. Fauna's silver was never recovered, not a single coin. $18,000 worth of untraceable bullion gone, along with the woman who was carrying it. John Frey did what any father would do, except he did it harder and longer than most people could endure. He practically moved to Josephine County. He camped in the woods. He searched the logging roads. He knocked on doors. He drove the back roads with a photograph of his daughter, asking anyone who would listen if they'd seen her face. He did this for years, and he built a theory, not from speculation, but from the evidence. The hitchhiker near Fish Hatchery Road, the known drug property on that same road. The sighting, reported by credible witnesses, of Fauna riding in the passenger seat of a white BMW driven by a bearded male, emerging from the driveway of that same property after she had officially disappeared. The mutilated saddlebag with her name on it, found at that same property. Every thread leads back to Fish Hatchery Road. Every piece of evidence circles the same address, and the silver, 40 pounds of it worth a small fortune in a cash-starved rural economy, has never surfaced. Somewhere between a grocery store receipt for 10 cans of tuna and a locked Jeep on a dead-end logging road, Fauna Frey crossed paths with something she couldn't survive. The purchases say she was planning a tomorrow. The Jeep says somebody made sure she didn't get one, and that Jeep sat on Reuben Mountain Road for 3 months, locked, silent, covered in dust and pine needles, waiting for someone to find it, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. We're still waiting. Skyline Elementary School sits at the edge of Portland, Oregon, where the suburbs just stop. One side of the road, you've got manicured lawns and school buses. The other side, you're staring into the mouth of the Cornelius Pass, a rain-soaked tangle of ravines, ancient timber, and underbrush so thick that search teams have described it as nearly impenetrable. It's the kind of place where civilization and wilderness share a property line. And on the morning of June 4th, 2010, a 7-year-old boy walked down a hallway inside that school and simply ceased to exist. His name was Kyron Horman. And 15 years later, no one can explain what happened to him. Let's set the scene. It's a Friday morning, early June in Portland, which, if you've ever been, doesn't mean sunshine and blue skies. The weather that day was classic Pacific Northwest misery. Low clouds, a heavy mist hanging in the trees, temperatures stuck in the mid-50s. The kind of damp that doesn't rain on you so much as it just absorbs into everything. Nearly ½ an inch of precipitation would accumulate over the course of the day, slowly saturating the ground, killing scent trails, and washing away any trace evidence that might have mattered later. But nobody was thinking about forensics that morning. Nobody was thinking about anything dark at all, because inside the school it was pure chaos, the good kind. Skyline Elementary was hosting its annual science fair, and the building was packed wall to wall with parents, teachers, grandparents, and kids bouncing off the walls with excitement. The hallways were a traffic jam of poster boards and proud smiles. It was loud, it was bright, it smelled like school cafeteria coffee and dry erase markers. It was exactly the kind of environment where every adult in the building felt completely, utterly safe. And right in the middle of that happy chaos was a little boy named Kyron Richard Horman, 7 years old, 2nd grade, wearing a black t-shirt with the CSI television logo on it and a pair of glasses that were probably slightly too big for his face. He was beaming. He'd built a science fair project about the red-eyed tree frog, and he was so proud of it that he could barely contain himself. This wasn't a kid having a bad day. This wasn't a kid looking for an exit. This was a kid in his absolute element, surrounded by people he knew, doing something he loved. He arrived at school that morning with his stepmother, Terry Horman. They walked the hallways together, checking out the other exhibits. Terry snapped photographs. At around 8:15 a.m., the school PTA president, Gina Zimmerman, saw them standing together in front of Kyron's tree frog display. Everything was perfectly, painfully normal. At approximately 8:45 a.m., Terry Horman takes what will become one of the most famous photographs in the history of Oregon crime. Kyron, smiling broadly, standing next to his science project. That image, a happy kid in a CSI shirt proud of his tree frog poster, will haunt this state for the next decade and a half. It is the last confirmed photograph of Kyron Horman alive. After the photo, according to Terry's account, she watched Kyron walk down the hallway toward his classroom. He was heading to math. She turned and left the building. That's her story. And then, silence. At 10 a.m., classes officially begin. Kyron's homeroom teacher, Christina Porter, takes attendance. Kyron is not in his seat. She marks him absent. But here's the thing. She doesn't call anyone. She doesn't raise an alarm. Why? Because she saw Terry on campus that morning. She assumed, logically enough, that Kyron had a doctor's appointment and his stepmother had taken him home early. The school's automated absence notification system, the one designed specifically to alert parents when a child doesn't show up, never fires. No phone call is made, no text is sent, no email goes out. Think about that for a second. A 7-year-old boy is missing from his classroom on a day his stepmother was physically seen in the building, and the institutional response is nothing. The system that exists specifically for this exact scenario completely fails. And in that failure, whoever or whatever took Kyron Horman from that hallway is gifted the most dangerous thing a predator can receive: time. 7 hours of it. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Caney Horman, Kyron's father, and Terry walk to the neighborhood bus stop to pick Kyron up. The bus pulls in. Kids file off. Kyron is not among them. The bus driver says he never got on. He was never at school today, as far as the bus driver knows. They call the school. And the school tells them what should have been communicated 7 hours earlier. Kyron was marked absent from every class after the science fair. He hadn't been seen since roughly 9 a.m. The panic is immediate and absolute. 911 is called at approximately 3:45 p.m. By evening, search teams are assembling at the school. By 8:30 p.m., the FBI has been notified. By the following morning, the National Guard is on site. What follows is the single largest search and rescue operation in the history of the state of Oregon. Hundreds of personnel, helicopters, thermal imaging cameras, K-9 units, grid searches through thousands of acres of dense, wet forest. They find nothing. Not a scrap of clothing, not a broken twig, not a single footprint, not his glasses, not his CSI t-shirt, nothing. Now, this is where it gets strange. And I don't mean strange in the way true crime stories usually get strange, with some weird piece of evidence or an unreliable witness. I mean strange in the way that defies basic physical logic. Let's start with what we know. Kyron was inside a school building, a busy school building filled with adults. He was seen by a classmate near the south entrance of the school at approximately 9 a.m. That is the last verified sighting. Class starts at 10. That gives us a window of roughly 60 minutes during which a 7-year-old child vanishes from inside a building, without a single person seeing him leave, without a single security camera capturing his exit, and without making a single sound that anyone remembers hearing. How? Seriously, sit with that for a moment. How does that happen? A child doesn't evaporate. He either walked out of that school on his own 2 feet, or somebody carried him out. If he walked out alone, where did he go? The school sits on the edge of a forested canyon. If he wandered into those woods, search teams would have found something: a shoe, a torn piece of fabric, disturbed undergrowth, a scent trail. They found none of that. In over 15 years, not a single piece of physical evidence has ever been recovered from those woods. And if someone took him? If a stranger walked into that school during the chaos of a science fair, intercepted a 7-year-old boy, and walked him out to a car? How do you do that without a single parent, teacher, or staff member noticing? How do you walk a child out of a crowded building without that child screaming, crying, or resisting in any way that draws attention? These aren't rhetorical questions. These are the questions investigators have been unable to answer for 15 years. But here's the thing. Let's talk about Terry Horman, because no conversation about this case avoids her. Terry was the last known adult to be with Kyron that morning. After leaving the school at approximately 8:45 a.m., her account of the day gets complicated. She says she drove around on rural roads near the school to soothe her toddler daughter, who had an earache. She visited a gym, she ran errands, she eventually returned home. At 1:21 p.m., roughly 4.5 hours after Kyron was last seen, she logged onto Facebook and posted that photograph of Kyron smiling next to his tree frog project. The same photo she'd taken that morning. Now, let's look at the facts and apply the logic gap. If Terry Horman harmed Kyron, she did so within a devastatingly tight window. She was confirmed at the school at 8:45 a.m. She had a toddler with her. The terrain around Skyline Elementary is rugged, isolated, and disorienting, but it is also the exact kind of terrain where a body could be concealed and never found. She drove on rural logging roads that morning. She was not GPS tracked. Her movements during those critical hours are essentially her word against the void. But, and this is critical, despite being the most scrutinized person in the state of Oregon for years, despite reportedly failing multiple polygraph examinations, despite immediately hiring a high-profile criminal defense attorney, Terry Horman has never been charged with a crime. She has never been officially named as a suspect. Not one piece of physical evidence, not DNA, not fiber, not digital data, has ever connected her to Kyron's disappearance. She has maintained her innocence from the very beginning. So where does that leave us? A 7-year-old vanishes from a crowded school in broad daylight. The most obvious person of interest has no physical evidence against her. The wilderness surrounding the school has surrendered absolutely zero clues, despite being searched by hundreds of professionals. No body, no clothing, no blood, no witnesses to an abduction, no witnesses to a wandering child, no witnesses to anything at all after 9 a.m. It is, in the most literal sense, a locked room mystery. Except the room was a public school on a Friday morning, and the lock was a crowd of parents who were supposed to be watching. The disappearance of Kyron Horman triggered the largest search in Oregon history. It generated thousands of tips. It consumed years of investigative resources. It destroyed a marriage. Caney filed for divorce from Terry shortly after. It launched a public crusade by Kyron's biological mother, Desiree Young, who has never stopped fighting, never stopped searching, and never stopped publicly demanding answers. And after all of that, after the FBI, the National Guard, the search dogs, the thermal cameras, the polygraphs, the media firestorm, the shattered families, and the sleepless nights, we have exactly what we had on the afternoon of June 4th, 2010. Nothing, no body, no crime scene, no confession, no closure. Just a photograph of a smiling boy in a CSI t-shirt standing next to a poster about tree frogs taken at 8:45 on a Friday morning inside a school that was supposed to be the safest place in the world. He walked down a hallway, he turned a corner, and he stepped right off the face of the earth. Crater Lake in the summer is one of the most beautiful places on Earth. 6 miles across, nearly 2,000 feet deep, water so impossibly blue it looks like someone poured sapphire dye into a volcanic crater and called it a national park. People drive hours to stand at the rim and take photographs. It's on postcards. It's on screensavers. It's the kind of place that makes you believe Oregon was designed by an artist. Crater Lake in January is a different planet entirely. In the winter of 1975, the park received over 100 inches of fresh snow in a matter of days. That's not a typo. Over 9 feet of powder on top of a snowpack that was already measured in the dozens of feet. The rim road was buried. The trails were gone. The entire landscape was a smooth, featureless white desert at nearly 8,000 feet of elevation, where temperatures plunged well below zero and the wind could strip the warmth out of you faster than you could zip up a jacket. It was, in every measurable way, one of the most lethal environments in the continental United States. A 19-year-old kid with a camera walked into that landscape, and when they found what was left of him nearly 2 years later, he was 14 miles from where he started, in a canyon that should have been physically impossible for him to reach. Nobody has ever been able to explain how he got there, and the condition of his remains only makes it worse. His name was Charles Wood McCullough, and he was from Alexandria, Virginia. 19 years old, an amateur photographer, and the kind of young adventurer that the 1970s produced by the thousands, kids who stuck out their thumbs on highway on-ramps and crisscrossed the country on a budget of almost nothing, chasing landscapes and the feeling of being completely, wonderfully free. By late January of 1975, Charles had hitchhiked his way across the country to Eugene, Oregon, where he was staying with his girlfriend. He had a plan for the week, and it was simple. Hitch a ride south to Crater Lake, spend a day or two photographing the winter scenery, and be back in Eugene within 5 days, by February 3rd at the latest. He wasn't planning an expedition. He wasn't attempting a backcountry traverse. He was a kid with a backpack and a camera who wanted to take some snow pictures. But here's the detail that matters. Charles McCullough was not equipped for what Crater Lake was about to throw at him. He had a standard backpack. He had boots. He had warm clothing. What he did not have were snowshoes. He did not have skis. He did not have crampons or gaiters or any of the specialized alpine gear that anyone attempting to travel through deep snow at high elevation would consider non-negotiable. He was dressed for a cold day, not for an Arctic survival scenario. He was last seen alive at the Dray Creek store near Diamond Lake, making his way toward the park's north entrance. He seemed relaxed. He seemed fine. He was just a kid heading into the mountains for some photographs. And then a storm hit. 34 inches of snow fell almost immediately after his arrival in the area, followed by wave after wave of additional storms that would ultimately dump over 100 inches across the park. The landscape erased itself. Tracks vanished, roads disappeared. Any trace of a 19-year-old kid walking through that terrain was buried under a white void before anyone even knew he was missing. February 3rd came and went. Charles didn't return to Eugene. His girlfriend raised the alarm. His father flew out from Virginia and did something extraordinary. He essentially moved to Crater Lake. He camped in and around the park for months, personally organizing and directing search efforts alongside park rangers, air searches, ground searches. He walked the terrain himself, calling his son's name into a silence that never answered back. They found nothing, not a footprint, not a piece of clothing. The snow had swallowed everything. The park melted slowly through the spring and summer of 1975, and still nothing emerged. Charles McCullough had simply been absorbed into the landscape. And then, in October of 1976, a full year and a half after he vanished, 2 hikers from Texas were walking the Pacific Crest Trail. They took a wrong turn onto an abandoned spur trail near an area called Sphagnum Bog and stumbled onto a dirty, ripped backpack sitting in the brush. Park rangers were called. They opened the pack and found a Volkswagen key in a zippered pocket. They compared it to a photocopy of Charles McCullough's key that his family had provided to the investigation. It matched. Rangers followed the drainage downhill from the backpack's location, deeper into the Bybee Creek Canyon. And what they found at the bottom is one of the strangest, the most disturbing discovery scenes in the entire history of the National Park Service. Now, this is where it gets strange, and I need to walk you through this carefully, because the details of what was found in that canyon don't just raise questions, they break the case wide open and then refuse to give you any answers. The remains of Charles McCullough were found on a log in the Bybee Creek drainage. A park ranger with 30 years of experience later described the scene as the strangest he had ever encountered in his career. He said it looked as though Charles had sat down on the log and simply melted into his jeans. His jeans were there, draped over the log. They were unbuttoned, the belt was undone. His socks were still inside the jeans, bunched down at the ankles, and inside the socks were toe bones and a broken tibia. That was it. With the lower half of a skeleton, still dressed, sitting on a piece of timber in the middle of nowhere. The crown of his skull was found 12 feet away, just the top portion of the cranium resting on the forest floor, separated from everything else. And that's where the inventory of what was found ends, because the list of what was missing is far more disturbing. His boots were gone. Heavy winter boots, the kind of footwear that has zero appeal to any animal scavenger, the kind that doesn't decompose, the kind that should absolutely still be there 18 months later. Gone. His shirt was missing, his heavy coat was missing, his wallet and identification, gone. And the camera, the entire reason Charles McCullers traveled to Crater Lake in the first place, the expensive photography equipment he specifically carried into the park to use, nowhere to be found. So let's talk about the math, because this is where every theory runs face first into a wall of physical impossibility. Charles McCullers' remains were found in the Bee Creek drainage, 14 miles from the north entrance where he began his trek into the park. 14 miles in late January, through over 100 inches of fresh, unbroken snow, without snowshoes, without skis, without any specialized equipment for traveling through deep powder at high altitude. If you've never tried to walk through deep snow, let me explain what happens. With every step, you post-hole, meaning your leg punches straight down through the surface, sometimes to your waist, sometimes to your chest. You have to physically lift your entire body weight back up and out of the hole before you can take the next step, which immediately punches down again. The caloric expenditure is astronomical. Your body burns through its energy reserves at a rate that makes normal hiking look like sitting in a chair. Even experienced mountaineers with snowshoes can cover only a few miles per day in those conditions. Without snowshoes, in powder that deep, survival experts have stated plainly that covering 14 miles is physically impossible. So how did he get there? One theory suggested that maybe Charles walked inside the packed tracks of a snowmobile. A compacted snowmobile trail would give him a solid surface to walk on, potentially allowing him to cover the distance. But park officials shut that theory down immediately. Snowmobiles were strictly prohibited in that sector. And even if an illegal rider had entered the area, the snow was so deep and so fresh that no machine could have operated effectively enough to create a usable trail. Okay, so he didn't walk there, not under those conditions, which means one of two things. Either he got there before the major storms hit, meaning he covered 14 miles of rugged terrain in a very short window, or someone else brought him there, and this is where the condition of the remains starts to matter. Let's go back to those jeans. Unbuttoned, belt undone. No boots, no coat, no shirt. If we're being generous, we can attribute the unbuttoned pants to paradoxical undressing, a well-documented phenomenon in the final stages of hypothermia where the victim's nervous system misfires, creating a burning sensation that causes them to strip off their clothing. It happens. It's real. It could explain the pants. But it doesn't explain the boots. When a person experiences paradoxical undressing, they pull off layers, jackets, shirts, gloves. They don't unlace heavy winter boots, pull them off their feet, and then walk away barefoot in the snow. Boots are the last thing to come off, if they come off at all. And yet his boots were not at the scene. They were not found anywhere in the vicinity. They were not found anywhere in the park. They simply don't exist. And the camera. Charles McCullers' entire purpose for being in Crater Lake was photography. That camera was his most prized possession on this trip. If he died of exposure, the camera should be in his backpack or on his body. It isn't. If an animal scattered his remains, a camera doesn't get eaten or carried off. It's metal and glass and leather. It sits where it falls, but it's gone. Along with his wallet, along with his identification. Animals don't take wallets. Animals don't take cameras. Animals don't take boots and leave the socks. Charles McCullers' father believed his son was robbed and murdered. He believed someone picked Charles up while he was hitchhiking, killed him for his gear, and dumped his body in that canyon. It's a theory that answers the impossible geography. Someone with a vehicle could access terrain that a teenager on foot could not. It explains the missing valuables. It explains why the boots are gone. A killer takes the useful things and leaves the rest. But it raises its own questions. Why unbutton the pants? Why leave the backpack miles from the body? Why choose one of the most remote drainages in the entire park as a dump site? The official ruling is death by natural causes. Exposure. Hypothermia. The park's position is that Charles got lost in the storm, wandered into the drainage, succumbed to the cold, and over the following 18 months, snowmelt and animal scavenging scattered his remains and carried off his upper body. It's the tidy explanation, the one that fits into a report, but it doesn't explain how a 19-year-old walked 14 miles through 9 feet of powder without snowshoes. It doesn't explain where his boots went. It doesn't explain why his camera, the thing he came there for, vanished without a trace. Charles McCullough left Eugene, Oregon, with a backpack, a camera, and a promise to be home in 5 days. He walked into one of the most beautiful and most dangerous landscapes in America. And when the snow finally melted and the forest finally gave him back, what remained was a pair of jeans on a log, a broken bone, and a silence that has lasted 50 years. Somewhere between the highway and that canyon, something happened to Charles McCullough, something the snow buried, something the park has never explained, and the only witness was a frozen white wilderness that has never said a word. Crater Lake is the deepest lake in the United States. Nearly 2,000 feet of water sitting inside the collapsed caldera of an ancient volcano, ringed by sheer cliffs that drop hundreds of feet straight down to the surface. The water is so blue it looks fake, like someone photoshopped reality. It's one of those places that feels like it belongs on another planet, and every year 500,000 people drive up there to stand at the rim and stare at it. But step off the paved road, and the postcard ends. The ground beneath your feet is volcanic cinder, loose, shifting, ankle-deep pumice that gives way with every step like walking on a beach made of broken glass. The slopes are steep, unstable, and dotted with jagged rock outcroppings and hidden crevices that drop into nothing. The timber is thick and wet and dark, and in October, the weather turns fast. What starts as a crisp autumn afternoon can become freezing rain, high wind, and snow in the time it takes to eat a sandwich. On October 14, 2006, an 8-year-old boy ran up one of those cinder slopes, slipped over the ridge, and disappeared so completely that 200 searchers, helicopters with thermal cameras, and trained tracking dogs couldn't find a single trace of him. Not a footprint, not a thread, not a scent. His name was Samuel Bohelke, and he vanished in the time it took his father to run 50 feet. Let me set the scene. It's mid-October. Sammy Bohelke is 8 years old, visiting from Portland with his father, Kenneth. Kenneth and Sammy's mother had recently divorced, and this weekend was a father-son getaway. Drive down to the Diamond Lake area, stay in a rental cabin, and take a scenic afternoon drive along the rim of Crater Lake. It was supposed to be simple, quiet, the kind of low-key trip where a dad and his kid just spend some time together. Sammy was small for his age, 4'8", about 85 pounds. He was wearing a bright blue winter coat, the kind that practically glows against a gray volcanic landscape. He was a sweet, passionate, deeply stubborn kid, according to his mother. And there's one detail about Sammy that shapes everything about how this case unfolded. He had been diagnosed with a mild form of autism. This is critical, so let me explain why. Sammy's autism primarily manifested as an intense, overwhelming sensitivity to loud noises, bright lights, and chaotic stimuli. Things like whistles, sirens, air horns, shouting, the exact tools that search and rescue teams use to locate lost people, caused him severe distress. He wouldn't run toward those sounds. He would run away from them. He would hide. The very act of searching for Sammy may have driven him deeper into the wilderness. That fact will haunt every detail of this story. Late afternoon, October 14th. Kenneth and Sammy are driving along Rim Drive, the road that circles the caldera. They pull over at an isolated scenic turnout about a quarter-mile east of the Cleetwood Cove parking area. It's not one of the main overlooks. It's a quiet pull-off where you can step out of the car, stretch your legs, and take in the view. Sammy gets out and starts playing on a steep, rocky cinder slope on the opposite side of the road from the lake. He's climbing, poking around in the rocks, doing what 8-year-olds do. And then he spots something, a patch of yellow coloring in the volcanic rock. He's convinced it might be gold. He won't leave. He's fixated on it, the way kids get fixated on things, and no amount of his father telling him it's time to go is going to change his mind. Kenneth recognizes the temperature is dropping, dusk is coming, the weather is turning. He walks back toward the car, hoping Sammy will follow. Sammy doesn't. Kenneth turns around and starts back up the hill to get him. And this is where it happens. Sammy sees his dad coming up the slope and interprets it as a game. Tag, chase. He starts running, not toward his father, but up and away, keeping about 50 feet between them. He's laughing. It's a game. He crests the rocky ridge and slips over the other side. On breaking line of sight for just a moment. Kenneth reaches the same ridge seconds later, maybe 10 seconds, maybe 15. He looks over the other side. Empty, silent, nothing. No Sammy running down the slope, no blue coat bobbing through the trees, no sound of footsteps in the cinder, no laughter. The landscape on the other side of that ridge is just rock and timber and the beginning of a very long, very dark drop toward the caldera. And the boy who was standing right there, seconds ago, is not anywhere. Kenneth searches immediately. He's calling Sammy's name, scrambling over the rocks, scanning the tree line. Nothing. He spends a couple of hours in the fading light, looking before he flags down a passing motorist who relays a 911 call. By nightfall, park rangers are on site. By the following morning, this has become a massive, multi-agency search operation. The numbers are staggering. Between 145 and 200 personnel. National Park Service, county sheriff's deputies, Forest Service crews, volunteer search and rescue teams, helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras designed to detect the body heat of a living person from altitude, trained tracking dogs. The search covered 6 square miles of some of the most rugged terrain in the Cascade Range, and it went on for days, battered by snow, freezing rain, and sub-freezing overnight temperatures. They found nothing. Not one piece of clothing, not one footprint in the cinder that led anywhere conclusive, not one heat signature on the thermal cameras. After 9 exhausting hours, a 16-person Forest Service crew emerged from the thick, wet woods and boulders with absolutely zero evidence that a child had ever been in the area beyond the ridge. The only object they recovered from the wilderness was a deflated yellow balloon. Now, this is where it gets strange. And I mean the kind of strange that makes experienced search professionals shake their heads because the physics of this disappearance don't work. Let's start with the speed. Sammy was 8 years old, 4'8", wearing a heavy winter coat, running uphill on loose volcanic cinder. If you've never walked on pumice, imagine running in deep sand. Your feet sink, you slide backward, every step costs twice the energy. Kenneth was an adult, presumably in reasonable shape, and he was only about 50 feet behind. The time gap between Sammy cresting that ridge and Kenneth reaching the same spot was a matter of seconds. In those seconds, Sammy would have needed to not only clear the ridge, but put enough distance between himself and the crest that he was completely invisible to his father, on a barren, open, volcanic slope. He would have needed to do this without making a sound. No tumbling rocks, no snapping branches, no giggling, and he would have needed to do it while wearing a bright blue coat that should have been visible against the gray and brown landscape for hundreds of yards in any direction. How? How does an 8-year-old accomplish that in 10 to 15 seconds on terrain that actively resists forward movement? Now let's talk about the dogs. Tracking dogs were deployed quickly. These are animals trained to follow the specific scent of a person through wilderness conditions. It's what they do. They were given Sammy's scent, they searched, and according to the reports, the dogs registered Sammy's scent at only one specific location on the rocky ridge. Searchers marked the spot with a pink ribbon tied around a dead tree. The scent trail ended there, abruptly, as if the boy had been standing at that exact point and then been lifted off the ground. Let that sit for a second. The dogs didn't follow a trail into the woods. They didn't track a path down toward the lake. They didn't indicate a direction of travel. They hit one point on the ridge and stopped. In the world of canine search and rescue, a scent trail that terminates at a single point without continuing in any direction is one of the most baffling results possible. A person who walks away leaves scent. A person who falls leaves scent at the bottom. A scent trail that simply ends means the person stopped being there. And then there's the search itself. 200 people. Thermal imaging helicopters, 6 square miles, days of searching. Sammy was wearing a bright blue coat. In October, the deciduous underbrush is thinning. The volcanic landscape is predominantly gray. A blue coat on that terrain is like a neon sign. Helicopter spotters should have seen it. Thermal cameras should have picked up body heat, even from a child huddled in a rock crevice. They detected nothing. The prevailing theory among investigators was that Sammy's autism caused him to hide, that the noise of the search, the helicopters, the shouting, the organized chaos of 200 people crashing through the woods triggered a sensory overload response, and he burrowed into a crack in the volcanic rock, pulled himself into the smallest space he could find, and went silent. It's a reasonable theory. It explains why he didn't respond to calls. It explains why he might have evaded detection. But it doesn't explain the dogs. If Sammy was hiding in a crevice within the 6 square mile search area, he was still breathing. He was still emitting scent. Tracking dogs don't need you to answer, they need you to exist. And the dog said he wasn't there. The search for Samuel Bohulka lasted days. It endured snow and freezing temperatures. It involved some of the most sophisticated search technology available. And it produced exactly one piece of evidence: a pink ribbon on a dead tree, marking the last place on Earth where a trained dog could detect the presence of an 8-year-old boy. The official stance is that Sammy likely succumbed to the elements or fell into one of the countless deep crevices in the volcanic rock, gaps that can swallow a small body and conceal it permanently. Crater Lake's geology is riddled with them. It's possible. It's the explanation that requires the fewest assumptions. But it doesn't explain the speed. It doesn't explain the silence. It doesn't explain how a child in a bright blue coat disappeared from an open volcanic slope in the time it takes to count to 10. And it doesn't explain why the dogs hit one spot on that ridge and stopped, as if the trail had been cut with scissors. Kenneth Bohulka reached the top of that hill, expecting to see his son on the other side, probably laughing, probably still running, probably thinking the whole thing was the funniest game in the world. Instead, he found an empty slope, a silent forest, and the beginning of a nightmare that has no ending. Sammy ran over that ridge, and somewhere between the crest and the other side, he stepped out of this world and into whatever comes next. The volcano kept him, and it has never given him back. Every small town in America has a county fair. You know the kind. Tilt-a-whirl spinning under strings of colored bulbs, funnel cake smoke drifting through the August heat, teenagers walking around in packs, loud and untouchable, spending crumpled dollar bills on ring toss games they'll never win. It's the one week of the year when the whole town shows up, and for a few nights, everything feels bright and loud and alive. Myrtle Point, Oregon, population 2,500, had the Coos County Fair. And in the summer of 1986, a 14-year-old boy walked into that fair with his little sister, bought her ride passes with his own money, and told her he'd meet her later by the Ferris wheel. He never showed up. He never came home. He never went anywhere, as far as anyone can tell. He just stopped existing somewhere between the neon lights and the tree line. And for nearly 40 years, the people in that town have kept their mouths shut about what happened to him. His name was Jeremy Bright, and somebody in Myrtle Point knows exactly where he is. Let me paint the picture. Myrtle Point sits in Coos County, deep in the timber country of southwestern Oregon. In 1986, this was a logging town in every sense: flannel shirts, pickup trucks, sawmill shifts, and a culture built around hard work and hard drinking. It wasn't a bad place, but it was isolated. The kind of town where the nearest city of any real size was an hour's drive away, where everybody knew everybody's business, and where things that happened after dark tended to stay after dark. The Coos County Fair was the highlight of the summer. The second week of August, carnival rides hauled in by transient workers, livestock competitions, deep-fried everything. And for the teenagers of Myrtle Point, it was the closest thing they had to freedom, a few days of unsupervised chaos where you could drift from the fairgrounds to the local swimming holes to the house parties and back again without any adult keeping tabs on you. It was loud and bright and smelled like popcorn and diesel fumes and cheap cologne. That's where Jeremy Dolan Bright found himself in the middle of August 1986. He was 14 years old, visiting from Grants Pass, about an hour east, staying at his former stepfather's house in Myrtle Point for the week. His parents had recently divorced, and the trip was supposed to be a fun break. Hang out at the fair, or earn a little spending money working at his aunt's restaurant, and look after his 9-year-old sister. Standard summer stuff. Jeremy was not the kind of kid who disappears. He was 6 feet tall and 140 pounds at 14, which tells you he was built like the athlete he was. Basketball, football, baseball, the works. Honor roll student, popular. The kind of kid who coached his little sister's softball team for fun. He had zero history of running away, zero history of depression, zero indicators that anything in his life was off. He was looking forward to starting high school in the fall. On August 13th, the day before he vanished, Jeremy called his mother from a payphone outside the local market. He told her he was having a great time. He sounded happy. He sounded like a 14-year-old boy at a county fair with money in his pocket and nowhere to be. Everything was completely, perfectly normal. August 14th. Jeremy spends the morning being a responsible older brother. He takes his sister and her friend to the fairgrounds, buys them all-day ride passes with his own cash, and tells her to meet him by the Ferris wheel at 5 o'clock. Then he heads to his aunt's restaurant to put in a few hours of work. At 4:45 p.m., he calls his mother again, long distance from a payphone, to confirm she'll be driving to Myrtle Point the next day, August 15th, to pick them up. Everything's on schedule. Everything's normal. That evening, around 9:40, Jeremy walks into a local tavern owned by his grandmother. His stepfather, Ole, is there. Jeremy asks him for a small loan, a few bucks, so he can go back to the fair the next day. Ole gives him the money. Jeremy walks out. And that's it. That's the last confirmed, undisputed moment anyone can verify seeing Jeremy Bright alive. What happens after 9:40 p.m. on August 14th depends entirely on who you ask, and almost nobody in Myrtle Point seems willing to give a straight answer. The next morning, Jeremy doesn't show up at the Ferris wheel. His sister waits. He doesn't come. She eventually goes back to the stepfather's house. When Jeremy's mother, Diane, arrives on August 16th to pick up her kids, she walks into the house expecting to find her son. Instead, she finds his belongings, his wallet, his apartment keys, and a brand new watch he'd recently purchased, sitting neatly on top of the television set. No Jeremy. But he had been missing for 2 days. Nobody had called her. Nobody had called the police. Nobody had done anything. Now, hold on. Let's look at those items on the TV because they tell a story that most people gloss over. The wallet, the keys, the new watch, all placed neatly on top of the television, not thrown on the floor, not scattered across a table in a hurry, neatly placed the way a person does when they come home for the night and empty their pockets before going to bed. That means Jeremy came back to the house after the tavern. He walked in, set his things down the way any kid would at the end of a long day, and presumably was settling in for the night. And then something drew him back outside. Something, or someone, pulled him out of that house after he had already come home and put his stuff away. Think about what he left behind. His wallet, which had the loan money in it, his keys, his watch, which by all accounts was his most prized recent purchase. A teenager who is running away takes his money. He takes the thing he just bought that he's proud of. He does not carefully arrange his valuables on the TV and then walk into the Oregon night with absolutely nothing in his pockets. Jeremy Bright did not run away. Something happened to him after he came home. And this is where it gets dark. Because in a town of 2,500 people, secrets don't stay secret. They become rumors. And the rumors in Myrtle Point about Jeremy Bright are specific, detailed, and horrifying. The first and most persistent rumor comes from a jailhouse informant. According to this account, Jeremy went to a local swimming hole that night where he encountered a group of older teenagers. He, one of them, showing off, fired a gun into the water. The bullet struck Jeremy. Panicking, the teenagers loaded the wounded boy into a vehicle and drove him to an isolated cabin within 10 miles of town, hoping to nurse him back to health. He bled to death. They buried him in a shallow grave. Police searched the area matching this description. They found nothing. A second rumor identified a specific burial site, a natural formation called a rock pot up Lee Valley Road, deep in the forest. A local resident publicly claimed that's where Jeremy's body was disposed of. Again, nothing was found. A third rumor is even more disturbing. This one suggests Jeremy attended an underage party where someone handed him a beer that had been laced with a powerful narcotic. Jeremy had a diagnosed heart murmur. The theory is that the drug triggered a fatal cardiac event, and a group of terrified teenagers hid his body to avoid prosecution. 3 separate rumors, 3 specific scenarios, 3 different groups of people who allegedly know exactly what happened, and in nearly 40 years, not one of them has produced a single piece of physical evidence. Let's sit with that. This is a town where you can't sneeze without your neighbor hearing it. Multiple people, teenagers at the time, adults now, allegedly witnessed or participated in events that led to a 14-year-old boy's death. Teenagers are not known for their ability to keep secrets. They brag. They crack under pressure. They tell their girlfriends, their best friends, their cellmates, and yet, across 4 decades, the wall of silence in Myrtle Point has held. How? How does that happen? In a town this small, with rumors this specific, how has nobody broken? That level of silence isn't accidental, it's enforced. Someone or some group of people has made sure that nobody talks. And that kind of sustained, organized silence is far more terrifying than any single act of violence. There is one more thread. Eyewitnesses reported seeing Jeremy in the passenger seat of a truck belonging to a local man named Terry Lee Steinhoff. Steinhoff was a former babysitter for the family, someone Jeremy would have recognized, someone he might have climbed into a vehicle with without hesitation. Years later, Terry Lee Steinhoff was convicted of the brutal murder of a 32-year-old woman. He died in prison in 2007. Whatever he knew about the night of August 14th, 1986, died with him. The case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, beaming Jeremy's face into millions of living rooms across the country. The show generated tips. It put national pressure on Myrtle Point, and still, nobody cracked. The town held its silence against the full weight of the national spotlight and didn't blink. Jeremy Bright has been missing for nearly 40 years. His mother never stopped looking. His sister grew up without her big brother. And somewhere in Myrtle Point, Oregon, or in the dense, dark forest that presses in from every side of that little town, a 14-year-old boy is waiting to be found. The people who know what happened are still alive. Some of them still live there. Some of them have children and grandchildren now. They drive past the fairgrounds every summer. They see the Ferris wheel go up. They hear the music. And they carry a secret that has outlasted the carnival. The sawmills and the logging trucks that once defined their town. I keep coming back to that television set, to the wallet and the watch placed neatly on top, the way a kid does when he's done for the night. Jeremy Bright came home. He set his things down. He was safe. And then he walked back out into the dark. And the dark never gave him back. There were flip-flops on the pavement. That's the detail that changes everything. Not kicked off in a struggle, not flung across the parking lot, just sitting there on the asphalt, neatly, the way they'd naturally slide off someone's feet if they were suddenly lifted off the ground. A bucket of soapy water next to them, a sponge, the lamppost she'd been cleaning still wet. It was 10 a.m. on a Monday morning, sunny, bright. The kind of May morning in Oregon where the light is so clean it makes everything look like a photograph. And a 19-year-old woman was standing in a parking lot in a college town, doing chores with her sister a few hundred feet away, surrounded by apartment windows and parked cars and all the ordinary infrastructure of a safe, normal day. And then she wasn't there anymore. Just the flip-flops, just the bucket, just the silence where a person used to be. Her name was Brooke Wilberger. And what happened to her on the morning of May 24th, 2004, is one of the most terrifying abduction cases in Oregon history, not because of what was found, but because of how little time it took for a life to be stolen in broad daylight in the most ordinary place imaginable, without anyone seeing a thing. Corvallis, Oregon, is a college town, home to Oregon State University, about 90 miles south of Portland, tucked into the Willamette Valley, surrounded by farmland and the foothills of the Coast Range. It's the kind of place where people leave their bikes unlocked on campus and walk home from the library at midnight without thinking twice. The crime rate is low, the streets are tree-lined, it feels safe because, statistically, it is safe. The Oak Park Apartments sit on the edge of the OSU campus. It's a standard-issue college housing complex, 2-story buildings, shared parking lots, a management office. In late May 2004, the academic year was winding down. Students were packing up, heading home, starting summer jobs. The complex was in that transitional mode where some units were full and some were empty, and the parking lot had a lazy, half-occupied feel to it. Brooke Carol Wilberger was 19 years old. She was a freshman at Brigham Young University in Utah, home in Oregon for the summer. Physically, she was 5'4", somewhere between 105 and 119 pounds. She was wearing a blue BYU soccer t-shirt, blue jeans, small hoop earrings, and a CTR ring, a Choose the Right ring, which, if you know anything about the LDS faith, she tells you something about the kind of person she was. Earnest, faithful, the kind of girl who wore her values on her hand. Her plans for the day were about as mundane as plans get. Her older sister and brother-in-law managed the Oak Park Apartments, and Brooke was earning summer wages by helping with maintenance, cleaning lampposts, washing light fixtures, doing the kind of low-stakes outdoor work that a college kid does to make money between semesters. It was a beautiful morning. She was outside. She was safe. She had family nearby. Late morning, May 24th. Brooke is in the parking lot working her way through the exterior lampposts with a bucket of soapy water and a sponge. Her sister's in the complex handling other tasks. It's quiet. The sun is out. There's nothing about this moment that suggests danger in any form. At some point during the late morning, Brooke's sister checks on her. Brooke is not at the lamppost. She's not in the parking lot. She's not in the apartment. Her cleaning supplies are sitting on the pavement, bucket, sponge, right where she'd been working. And her flip-flops are on the ground nearby, abandoned, as if she'd stepped right out of them. Brooke didn't have her phone on her. She didn't have her car. She didn't have shoes. There was no note. There was no indication that she'd walked to a friend's apartment or ducked inside to use the bathroom. She was simply not there anymore, and the only evidence that she'd ever been there was a pair of shoes and a bucket of water slowly going cold in the sun. The family knew immediately. This wasn't a girl who wandered off. This wasn't a miscommunication. Brooke Wilberger would not leave her shoes on the pavement and walk away barefoot without telling anyone. The police were called. And unlike many missing persons cases, where there's a waiting period and a presumption that the person might turn up, law enforcement recognized the severity instantly. The abandoned shoes, the cleaning supplies left mid-task. Something had happened in that parking lot, and it had happened fast. What followed was one of the largest search and missing persons investigations in Oregon history. Thousands of tips, massive media coverage. The entire state knew Brooke's face within days, but for years, the case went nowhere. She had vanished so completely, so cleanly, that investigators had almost nothing to work with. Now, this is where it gets terrifying. Because the logistics of what happened in that parking lot should be impossible. Let's set the parameters. It's approximately 10 a.m. Broad daylight. The sun is shining. The Oak Park Apartments is a multi-building residential complex with dozens of units. There are windows facing the parking lot. People live there. People are awake. Cars are parked in the lot. It is not an alley in the middle of the night. It is not a remote trailhead at dusk. It is a suburban parking lot on a sunny Monday morning. And in that environment, someone drove in, located a 19-year-old woman, physically seized her, forced her into a vehicle, and drove away. Without a single resident looking out a window and seeing a struggle. Without a single person in the parking lot witnessing the abduction. This without Brooke having time to scream loudly enough for her sister, who was in the building, to hear. How fast does that have to happen? Think about it. A scream takes 1 second. A human being's instinct when grabbed is to fight, to yell, to thrash. Brooke was a healthy, athletic 19-year-old. She wasn't incapacitated. She wasn't impaired. She was standing upright, cleaning a lamppost, fully alert. For this abduction to produce 0 witnesses and 0 audible alarm, it had to be executed with a speed and violence so overwhelming that Brooke's ability to resist was neutralized before she could draw a full breath. And here's the thing. Tenants inside the complex did hear something. A single, sharp scream. Brief, cut short. By the time anyone looked out a window, there was nothing to see. The parking lot was empty. The bucket was there. But the flip-flops were there. The person was gone. The entire event, from approach to seizure to departure, took less time than it takes to read this paragraph. For years, that was all investigators had. A scream nobody saw the source of. A pair of flip-flops. And a girl who ceased to exist in the time between one lamppost and the next. But here's the thing about predators. They don't always get away clean twice. What investigators would eventually learn, years later, is that the abduction of Brooke Wilberger was not a random act of impulse. It was the final move in a morning-long hunt. On the morning of May 24, 2004, a 41-year-old man named Joel Patrick Courtney was driving a green Dodge Caravan through the streets around the Oregon State campus. He was high on cocaine, and he was hunting. Earlier that morning, he had approached 2 different young women on campus, one named Randy Honrud, another named Crystal Thornton, asking for directions, trying to engage them in conversation, testing for vulnerability. Both women sensed something wrong. Both walked away. Courtney didn't stop. He kept driving. He kept looking. And eventually, he pulled into the Oak Park Apartments parking lot and saw a young woman alone at the dead end of a parking corridor with her back to the lot cleaning a lamppost. The buildings blocked the sightline from most of the residential windows. Brooke was physically boxed in. The lamppost was at the end of a row, and Courtney positioned his van between her and the apartments, creating a wall that shielded the abduction from view. He used a FedEx envelope as a prop, a reason to approach without triggering alarm. Hey, do you know where this goes? A completely ordinary interaction, and when he was close enough, he produced a knife and attacked. The speed was overwhelming. The violence was immediate. Brooke was in the van before the scream that tenants heard had finished echoing off the building walls. That's how you abduct someone in broad daylight. You don't overpower them with strength. You close the distance with a lie, eliminate their reaction time with a weapon, and use architecture to hide the act from witnesses. It's not supernatural. It's tactical. And it's horrifying precisely because it's so calculated. What happened next is almost too terrible to describe, but it matters because it reveals the full scope of what Brooke endured. Courtney drove the van out of the parking lot with Brooke bound inside. Then he drove into the isolated logging roads of the Oregon Coast Range, the same kind of remote off-grid wilderness that features in so many of these Oregon cases. He kept her alive overnight, bound with duct tape in the vehicle, while he drove back into town to buy food. He returned to society, interacted with cashiers, bought a meal, and drove back to where a bound teenager was waiting in the dark. The following morning, when Brooke fought back, because she did fight back, because she never stopped trying, he killed her. He buried her remains in a shallow grave on an abandoned logging road between the towns of Blodgett and Wren. The break in the case came months later and thousands of miles away. Courtney was arrested in Albuquerque, New Mexico for the brutal assault of a foreign exchange student. A detective running a routine background check on Courtney noticed something. He had been in Corvallis, Oregon on May 24, 2004. The same day, the same town. DNA evidence recovered from Courtney's green van linked him to Brooke. An Oregon State employee identified him from a photo lineup. Confronted with the physical evidence and facing the death penalty, Courtney accepted a plea deal in 2009. He pleaded guilty to aggravated murder and led investigators to Brooke's grave. He received life in prison without parole. The case of Brooke Wilberger was solved. That's more than most families in these stories ever get. Her remains were recovered. Her killer was identified, convicted, and locked away. There is a resolution. But the terror of that morning doesn't resolve. Because what May 24, 2004, it proved is that safety is an illusion measured in seconds. Brooke was in a parking lot, in daylight, with family nearby. She was doing the most ordinary thing in the world, and a man who had already failed to lure two other women that same morning simply drove a few blocks, found a slightly better angle, and took her in the time it takes to exhale. He failed twice and didn't stop. He didn't go home. He didn't reconsider. He just kept driving until the geometry worked, until the van was between the girl and the windows, until the distance was close enough, until the angle was right. And then it was over. That's the thing nobody wants to hear. It wasn't a dark alley. It wasn't a bad neighborhood. It wasn't the middle of the night. It was a sunny Monday morning. And a pair of flip-flops on the pavement was the only thing left to prove she'd ever been standing there. The bus stop was less than 200 yards from her front door. That's the distance we're talking about. Not a hike through the woods, not a shortcut through an alley in a bad part of town. A short walk through a suburban apartment complex in Oregon City, Oregon, past parked cars and recycling bins and neighbors' kitchen windows to catch the morning school bus. It's the kind of walk a kid makes 1,000 times without thinking. Eyes half closed, backpack slung over one shoulder, still waking up. On the morning of January 9th, 2002, 12-year-old Ashley Pond walked out of her apartment to make that walk. She never reached the bus stop. She never reached anywhere. She just disappeared somewhere between her front door and the end of the parking lot. 2 months later, her best friend did the exact same thing. Same apartment complex. Same bus stop. Same result. And the man responsible was living right next door. Smiling at the cameras, telling reporters how worried he was. Let me set this up. Oregon City sits about 20 miles south of Portland, right where the Willamette River cuts through the basalt cliffs at the edge of the valley. In 2002, it's a working-class town. Not rough, not glamorous, just normal. Strip malls and fast food and neighborhoods where people leave for work at 7 in the morning and come home at 6. The Newell Creek Village apartment complex is exactly what you'd picture from that description. Dense, 2-story buildings, shared parking lots, thin walls, the kind of place where you know your neighbors by sight even if you don't know their names, because you see them hauling groceries up the same stairs every week. It's not the kind of place where you feel unsafe. It's the kind of place where you feel invisible, where life is so routine, so mundane, that nothing ever seems to happen. That's the environment. Now, meet the girls. Ashley Pond was 12 years old. Miranda Gaddis was 13. They were neighbors in the complex, classmates at the same middle school, and best friends in the way that only 12 and 13-year-old girls can be. Inseparable, always at each other's apartments, on the same dance team, sharing the kind of daily intimacy where one girl's routine is basically identical to the other's. They walked to the same bus stop every morning. They rode the same bus. They came home the same way every afternoon. They were not runaways. They were not troubled loners looking for an escape route. They were standard, relatable middle school kids whose entire world was contained within the radius of this apartment complex and the school bus that carried them out of it every weekday morning. January 9th, 2002. It's a Wednesday. The Pacific Northwest is doing what it does best in January. Cold, gray, damp, the sky sitting about 15 feet above the rooftops like a wet ceiling. Ashley Pond gets ready for school. She leaves her apartment sometime around 8 in the morning, heading for the bus stop. The walk is short, familiar. She's done it hundreds of times. She doesn't make it. The bus comes. Ashley isn't on it. When she doesn't come home that afternoon, her family raises the alarm, and the initial response from law enforcement is underwhelming. Now, I need to stop here, because this is one of the most infuriating logic gaps in the entire case. The initial police posture leaned toward treating Ashley as a runaway. A 12-year-old girl on a freezing January morning supposedly decided to abandon her life without packing a bag, without taking money, without telling her best friend who lived in the same building, without leaving a note, without contacting a single person she knew. She just woke up, walked out the door, and chose to vanish into the rain. That was the working theory. Think about that. You're 12 years old. You have no car. You have no money. It's 40-something degrees and drizzling. Where exactly are you running to? And more importantly, if you were planning to run, wouldn't you at least grab a coat and tell someone? The runaway theory doesn't survive 5 seconds of logical scrutiny. And yet it consumed precious investigative time during the window when the trail was freshest. Weeks pass, then months. Ashley Pond is simply gone. The community holds vigils, flyers go up, tips come in and lead nowhere. It's a single missing child case in a small town, and the terrible momentum of daily life begins to absorb the shock. People start to settle into the grim possibility that Ashley may never be found. And then it happens again. March 8th, 2002. 58 days after Ashley vanished. Another gray, cold morning at Newell Creek Village. 13-year-old Miranda Gaddis, Ashley's best friend, Ashley's neighbor, the girl who walked to that same bus stop every single day, leaves her apartment headed for school. She doesn't make it either. Same complex, same bus stop, same result. A second girl was taken from the same 200-yard stretch of suburban parking lot in broad morning daylight without a single witness seeing anything. This is the moment the math changes. One missing girl from a bus stop is a tragedy. 2 missing girls from the same bus stop in the same apartment complex 2 months apart is a pattern, and a pattern means a predator. The FBI deploys a full task force to Oregon City. The national media descends on this small town like a thunderstorm. Newell Creek Village goes from an anonymous apartment complex to the most terrifying address in America. Parents start driving their kids to school. Nobody walks anywhere alone. The bus stop sits empty. And everybody in that complex is asking the same question. Who is doing this? Who has access to this specific location, this specific routine, these specific girls? Who knows exactly when they leave for school, which route they walk, and where the blind spots in the parking lot are? The answer was close, horrifyingly close. Now, this is where it gets strange. And by strange, I mean the kind of strange that makes your skin crawl. Ward Weaver, the third, lived in the Newell Creek Village complex. He was a neighbor. His daughter was friends with Ashley and Miranda. He was a face these girls recognized, a voice they'd heard through apartment walls, a presence that carried zero alarm because he was just there, part of the furniture of their daily lives. And here's what makes this so much worse. Months before she disappeared, Ashley Pond had actually reported to police that Ward Weaver had attempted to sexually assault her at his home. She told them. A 12-year-old girl looked at an authority figure and said, "This man hurt me." No charges were filed. Weaver remained in the complex unrestricted, unmonitored, living steps away from the girl who had accused him. Let that sink in. The man who would eventually be proven to have killed both girls had already been reported by one of his victims. The system had a chance. It had a name, an address, and a specific accusation from a child. And it did nothing. After Miranda's disappearance, the FBI zeroed in on Weaver. But he didn't hide. He didn't lawyer up and go quiet. He did something far more disturbing. He went on television. In July of 2002, Ward Weaver sat down for a live interview on Good Morning America and complained on camera that the FBI was unfairly targeting him. He said agents were warning neighborhood parents to keep their daughters away from his house because, in his words, their daughter might be next. He looked into the lens and played the victim, a concerned neighbor being persecuted by overzealous investigators. He did this interview while both girls' bodies were on his property. Let's talk about the logistics, because this is the part that haunts every parent who has ever sent a kid to a bus stop. How does someone abduct 2 middle schoolers from a densely populated apartment complex without a single person seeing or hearing anything? No screams, no struggle visible from any window, no unfamiliar vehicle spotted idling in the lot, nothing. Twice. The answer is trust. These weren't stranger abductions in the traditional sense. This wasn't a man in a van pulling up to a kid she'd never seen before. Ward Weaver was someone Ashley and Miranda knew. He was their friend's dad. He was a neighbor they'd walked past 1,000 times. If he called one of them over on a cold morning, "Hey, come here for a second, I need to ask you something," there would be no alarm bells, no fight or flight response, no scream. Just a girl walking a few steps toward a familiar face, crossing an invisible threshold from safety into horror without even realizing the line existed. That's what makes this case so fundamentally terrifying. The predator didn't come from the outside. He didn't break in. He was already inside the perimeter. He was already part of the routine. He was already trusted. And that trust was the weapon. The break came in August 2002, when Weaver's own stepson called 911 to report that Weaver had violently attacked his girlfriend. During that call, the stepson explicitly told police they should be looking at Weaver for the missing girls. This time, law enforcement acted. On August 24th, FBI agents executed a full search warrant on Weaver's property. In a storage shed behind the house, they found the remains of Miranda Gaddis concealed inside a cardboard box that had once held a microwave oven. The next day, using ground-penetrating radar, they identified an anomaly beneath a concrete slab in Weaver's backyard, a slab he had poured months earlier, telling neighbors it was the foundation for a hot tub. Excavators broke through the concrete and unearthed a 55-gallon steel drum. Inside were the remains of Ashley Pond. She had been buried in his backyard the entire time. Through the searches, through the FBI task force, through the national media coverage, through his television interview, during which he stood directly on top of the concrete slab beneath which a 12-year-old girl was entombed, looked into the camera, and said he was innocent. Ward Weaver III pleaded guilty to 2 counts of aggravated murder in 2004, accepting consecutive life sentences to avoid the death penalty. While incarcerated, he confessed to Miranda's younger sister that he had killed both girls with his bare hands. Then, he told the surviving sister that she had been his next target. There's one more detail about this case that I can't leave out, because it says something profound about the nature of what happened here. Ward Weaver, the third's father, Ward Weaver II, was also a convicted double murderer. He killed a young couple and buried them beneath a concrete patio at his own home in California. Father and son, 20 years apart, using the same method, burying their victims under their own properties. If you ever wanted evidence that evil can be inherited, learned, absorbed, passed down like a family trade, the Weaver family is the darkest case study you'll ever find. Ashley Pond and Miranda Gaddis were taken from a walk they'd made 1,000 times, from a bus stop they could see from their bedroom windows, by a man they recognized, and nobody saw a thing. The most dangerous predator isn't the stranger in the dark. It's the neighbor who waves hello every morning, the one who already knows your name, your schedule, and exactly which way your daughter walks to school.